So today we are going to have a look at what's happening in the USA, especially with the first impeachment to a sitting US president, and what the president could, let's say, mobilize, or was it the call of the wild for Trump? Bob, could you please introduce yourself and explain what is happening?
Hi, I'm Dr. Bob Sinclair. I'm trained as a social psychologist, and I haven't done social psychological research for a while. I've been looking at other things, but all of a sudden, social psychology is in the news again. And it all revolves around Trump. Now, to be honest with you, it's revolved around Trump for the last 4 years. And so I was always thinking about it in the context of Trump's behavior. But how do I say it? The entire democratic world, and also the parts of the world that aren't democracies, where people are promoting democracies, has to look at this and say, what kind of hypocrisy is going on in the United States of America? And, you know, at least they managed to get their democracy back today. But I mean, Trump has spent his entire time in office trying to undermine democracy. He's a fascist. There's no other way to describe him. He's a fascist. And now we're in a position where, I mean, everybody saw what went on at the Capitol the other day. And you know, these were people who Trump incited. Now, the arguments, I watched the entire impeachment proceedings today. And some of the arguments that Republicans were making was, well, no, the FBI had heard that this was going to happen, and he didn't directly incite it with his speech, and he didn't incite sedition with his speech. But the reality of this is, for the past, since the election, well, even before the election, okay, essentially Trump has developed a cult that surrounds him. After the election, he was spreading misinformation and disinformation that he'd actually won by a landslide and that this election was stolen from him, when in fact there was absolutely zero evidence to support this position. However, his cult believes him. So you've got over 70 million Americans who believe Trump. Now, Trump gets up in front of people the other day and says, let's walk down to the Capitol. And so does Don Jr. There's, let's walk down to the Capitol. And then, of course, they just take off and go watch the violence that incurs at the Capitol. And from the reports that have been on the news, enjoyed watching it. So you can't say, oh, gee, no, he didn't incite it yesterday. He's been in, or a couple of days ago, he's been inciting this since the night of the election, okay? And when you've got a group of followers who believe every word that comes out of your mouth, and what they do is, you know, this gets back to social psychology, is they encode information that's consistent with their beliefs, and they either fail to encode or counter-argue things that aren't consistent with their beliefs. I mean, they're conspiracy theorists, okay? So you can't argue with a conspiracy theorist, because if you're a conspiracy theorist, you're also a member of a cult. You know, this is it. But Trump has a big cult. So when you think about cults, you think about people who get indoctrinated in a particular manner. Whether it be there was this cult, this sexual cult in New York, where these women were being taken advantage of and being branded by this guy who they worshiped for some crazy reason, okay? And then what you have to do when you get somebody out, and often, often people, their family pulls them out of the cult. They have to go through an entire process, psychological process of what's called deprogramming. That's basically that, and this takes a long time and it's intensive. It's to get them to understand that their belief system is just out of whack with reality, okay? Well, this guy had, I don't know, let's say, I'll just pick a random number, 1,000 people in his cult. We're talking 70 million Americans. How do you deprogram 70 million Americans? Jim Jones, you're too young to remember this, but Jim Jones started this religious group that initially started out just fine. But then what happened was he decided that he was the Messiah and he got 5,000 people to follow him to Guyana. And then eventually some of the people realized that this was messed up and tried to escape. And the US got notified and Jim Jones got them all to drink Kool-Aid that was laced with cyanide and they all died. Okay, a lot of them died. A lot of them were killed actually by Jim Jones guards too. Well, okay. Now that's 5,000 people. We're talking 70 million. And this also happens with religious extremists too, is that religion is a fine thing, except when you get extremists on one side and extremists on the other. If you look at the United States, 98% of domestic terrorism that's happened in the United States has been committed by white Christian nationalists, neo-Nazis, and these are domestic terrorists. And then what happened this was sedition, is that Trump incited sedition and the sedition happened at the Capitol building. But he's been inciting sedition slowly over time, getting more people to believe his lies. And there's a process here too. A lot of those people were going to the Capitol building to exercise their First Amendment rights in the US. In the US, there is a First Amendment right to free speech, okay? In Canada, we don't quite have that right because in Canada, we have hate speech laws. So, you can't say things in Canada that direct hatred towards another group of people. In the United States, you can. You can't incite violence, okay? You can't say, for example, all Greeks are evil. I'm using Greeks because I'm half Greek. All Greeks are evil, and you could say that in the United States. You say, well, all Greeks are evil and they should be killed. Well, you can't say that, okay? That's the difference between, now in Canada, if you said all Greeks are evil, that would be hate speech directed towards an ethnic group, okay? So you can't do that. But in the United States, there you have no problem saying all Greeks are evil, but you can't say all Greeks are evil and we should kill them. Now, a lot of these people went up just to exercise their First Amendment rights. They believed that the election was stolen. They wanted to support Trump, this sort of thing. Another social psychological phenomena that happens is called de-individuation. And what happens is people will do things when they're part of a crowd or a mob that they wouldn't do normally. And part of this is because you feel like you're part of this mob and you get pulled into it, and you might you might, for example, commit crimes that you wouldn't have done, like smash windows on the doors of the Capitol building, or, steal things from the Capitol building and get your picture taken with them. Okay, I mean, this is the kind of thing that people do when they de-individuate, is that they identify with this group and they become part of the group mentality and they lose their individual mentality. So all of this stuff just turned into a confluence that became a tornado of insanity in the United States. So what are my worries? Well, the FBI believes that there's the possibility for armed insurrections at every state capital in the United States. They also believe that there's the potential for armed insurrection at the inauguration of Joe Biden. There have been death threats. A lot of Republicans today, like 10, okay, that's a lot, really, in reality, because they bucked their party and voted to impeach Trump, okay? A lot of Republicans, it turns out, have privately said they're afraid to do anything that crosses Trump because his cult might try and kill them. Like, for example, the guy who invented voting machines that were used in the election, okay, he got doxxed on, and so people put out photographs of his house, and he was being harassed on social media for fixing the election, which he had nothing to do with. And in fact, those voting machines, there's no problems with those voting machines, but the Trump cult believes him. So now this guy had to take his family and they're living in hiding, okay? So, so there are politicians that don't want to cross Trump's cult. They don't want to upset Trump's cult. And, they have legitimate reasons for fearing for their lives. They had people who wanted to go in and hang Mike Pence, the vice president, because the vice president would not do something that he constitutionally couldn't do anyway, which was overturn the election. Mike Pence went in and did, and he already announced that he was doing this. This is my constitutional duty. I'm going in to valid, we're going to, the Electoral College is going to meet, and this is what we're doing. Well, all of a sudden, the Trump cultists want to kill Mike Pence. And they're chanting, kill Mike Pence, when they're in front of the Capitol building. So yeah, these people have legitimate reasons for being afraid. Now, so my fears are armed insurrections, right? By people who have become members of this cult. And it's not just stupid people that become cultists, okay? I am going to point out something, though, that, there are data on. 40% of Americans think that humans and dinosaurs were wandering the earth together 6,000 years ago, and 10% of Americans can't find the United States on a map of the world. You can just take those data and let them speak for themselves. And I'm sure many of those people are part of the Trump cult. But there are people who are part of the Trump cult who might not be stupid, but there are a lot of Republicans who stood up, who are really conservative, okay? They're really opposed to the Democrats, but they stood up, like George Conway, who has been speaking out against Trump for forever, almost, just saying this guy is insane. He shouldn't be in power. And his wife at the same time, Kellyanne Conway, is a Republican who was Trump's advisor. And I can't imagine what dinner would have been like around the Conway household. Eventually, they both, George Conway was the head of the Lincoln Project, which was Republicans trying to get rid of Trump. And Kellyanne Conway, of course, is the advisor and does a lot of the speaking for Trump. Can you imagine the two of them having dinner together? Their daughter, their 15-year-old, she might be 16 now, has 21 million followers on Twitter, and she wants to be emancipated. She does not want to be in that household anymore. First of all, she has political beliefs that are nothing like her parents. And secondly, she just hates it there. Anyway, but so I'm not trying to say to you that, you know, Republicans are stupid and Democrats aren't. What I'm trying to say is that a lot of the Republicans who didn't support the impeachment today, I think did so for fear of their lives. It's going to be a slightly different scenario when Biden takes over. They control both the House and the Senate. Trump's trial for impeachment will not, or his impeachment trial, just because you're impeached doesn't mean you're guilty, okay? So the trial won't occur until after Biden is president. And then, you know, the evidence has to be presented. So if you just look at that one speech where he gets these people to, you know, encourages them to go to the Capitol building, there are ways that it can be interpreted as possibly not inciting sedition, right? And that depends on a legal argument. But there are ways in which it can be interpreted as citing sedition. So again, it becomes a legal argument. But you can't just take that one speech out of context. You need to look at what his supporters have been saying for him, the words that he's been using. There's the phone call that the Republican Attorney General of Georgia recorded where Trump was trying to get him to illegally overthrow the election results in Georgia, okay? I mean, that's obviously interfering with the democratic process, you know. So now, Trump's got, okay, what's the date today? The 13th?
Yeah.
So Trump has one more week in power. It's the 14th where you are. It's the 13th where I am.
Yeah, exactly.
He's got one more week in power. I was reading about some crazy things that he could do, okay? Without too much, without the ability to have too many people interfere. Like, it's possible that he could launch a nuclear attack on somebody. And so, for example, the most likely target would be Iran, right? He's still president. He has the nuclear codes for one more week. That scares the hell out of me. It should scare the hell out of the world. I mean, like, somebody should just tie him up. See, the other alternative was in the US was having the vice president get together with the cabinet, the secretaries of like the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Transportation, all this kind of thing, and invoke what's called the 25th Amendment. And that says, no, he's incapable of conducting the duties of the President of the United States. There's a history of the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment only came part of the Constitution in the 1960s when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, because there was a time where he was brain dead, but there wasn't any president. So they had this, they created, and then he died. And when he died, the succession as it goes, Lyndon B. Johnson became the president of the United States. But they put this into place in case they ever had a situation like this again, where a president was, so for example, if there was an assassination attempt and the person was wounded to the point that they could not do the work of president, then they'd invoke the 25th. The vice president would take over being president until, for example, the president got better. Okay. Or if it was some kind of damage that was just irreparable, the president would no longer be able to would be fit for duty, and it would move to the vice president. In the case of Trump, it would be a situation where they say you're insane, okay? And we're removing you from office. Pence decided not to do that. Nancy Pelosi gave him 24 hours to make a decision. He decided not to do it. And now Trump has made history by being the first president in the history of the United States to be impeached twice. So that's kind of my take on what's going on in the United States. I'm watching it unfold from Canada right next door, but I used to live in the United States, so I'm very familiar with the political system. And it certainly wasn't, nothing like Trump occurred when I lived in the United States.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
That also brings up another issue having to do with the Trump presidency. Is there's this concept in social psychology that Irving Janis developed in the 1960s, and then he wrote a book in the 1970s that sort of talked about the geopolitical implications of this term called groupthink. And the idea behind groupthink is if you surround yourself with people who are just going to agree with you, you can make some really bad decisions. And so what happened with John F. Kennedy was his initial cabinet didn't suggest any alternatives when they armed Cubans to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. And that became known as the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And the reason for there are a lot of reasons that go into groupthink. People don't want to rock the boat because they don't. This goes back to conformity studies that Ash did in the 1940s and 1950s, people don't want to rock the boat. They also don't want to lose credits with the leader. That goes back to work that a guy named Hollander did. They essentially want to be liked by the group. Well, the problem with that is that then nobody says, but what if, okay? So what Kennedy did was intentionally bring people into his cabinet whose jobs were to disagree, whose jobs were to challenge, whose jobs were to try and come up with alternative solutions to situations. And doing so was credited for the successful outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest we've been to nuclear war without being a nuclear war since the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. Now, Trump did the same thing with, what he did was he got rid of every adult in the room. Anybody who didn't agree with him, he got rid of. And then all he did was surround himself with people who would agree with him on everything. And look where that led. So there's a whole psychology behind explaining Trump, aside from the fact that some people claim that he's a narcissistic sociopath. Now, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so, I don't know, but he certainly sounds like, when I used to teach introductory psychology, he kind of sounds like the textbook definition of a narcissistic sociopath. So anyway, that's pretty much my take on what's going on in the United States. I'm hoping it gets better. Here's one final problem.
Yeah.
Is that because of all of the fear about potential armed uprising at various state capitals and during the inauguration in Washington, and also possibly before the inauguration in Washington, the National Guard is being deployed to all of the state capitals and to Washington. Well, the National Guard was in charge of the vaccine distribution program. So now what happens is the vaccines aren't getting distributed in the United States, and they won't be for a few weeks. Everything's going to shut down in terms of vaccinating people for COVID. And the United States is among the worst in the world right now in terms of its COVID numbers. So, this is just a confluence of insanity. and the outcome in the short run is not going to be, it's not good. It doesn't look good right now. And I'm hoping it's going to look much better when Biden takes over. And not to be honest with you, it's not like Biden has a squeaky clean history either, too, okay? I mean, politicians are politicians, then they all have histories. That's why I like doing sciences. Yeah, I have a history too, but it's irrelevant. I use the data to drive my decisions, and I don't have to answer to politicians. And it's probably better that way because I speak my mind. Let the data speak. And this is why, in Canada, there are three major political parties. There's the Conservative Party that's pretty right wing. There's the Liberal Party that's left of center. There's the New Democratic Party that's further left of center. And then the Green Party is mostly big in British Columbia. I've voted throughout my lifetime. I've voted for all three of the major parties, except that when I voted for the Conservative Party, they weren't the Conservative Party. They were the Progressive Conservative Party, and they are no longer progressive. But throughout my lifetime, I voted for all three of the major parties, either at the provincial or at the federal level, because I don't vote based on party. I vote based on policy. And if I agree with the policy, I'm going to vote for that party. And that's like being driven by data. And I always let the data speak. If the data say this, data don't lie, politicians do. So that's my closing remarks. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question here. Like, you have been in this modern civilization for more than a century now, and now it takes only 4 years to uncover all of this stupidity, all of this like unbased objection, all of this insurrection and violence. Where had this been hidden?
Democracies are fragile things. And when you think of empires, okay, the Americans, when the Americans had their revolution, they just replaced, British royalty with American royalty. Okay, rich Americans took over the country. Instead of paying Britain taxes, you started paying the American government taxes, and it was wealthy people who were running the country, and it's been like that, basically forever. It still is, and and so, you know, it wasn't, they had slavery until the Civil War. So it's not like everybody was equal. And empires rise and fall. You know, the United States started in 1776, and, you know, now it's, you know, 2021. But yeah, might be an end of an empire. I hope not, but it could be. I mean, you know, the Roman Empire didn't last all that long historically. Alexander the Great didn't last all that long in the grand scheme of things. The Chinese dynasties changed, you know, every few hundred years they changed. The British Empire, well, guess what? Second World War ended the British Empire. There's no British Empire anymore. There's the UK. And Scotland, I think, might leave the UK because they're not too happy with Boris Johnson right now in terms of Brexit. So empires arrive, empires fall. Also, there are so many different kinds of democracies in the world that there are some that are more fragile than others. And the kind of democracy that you have in the United States is more fragile than the kind we have in Canada or they have in England, for example, because it's hard to get a cult of personality in the way a parliamentary system is much different, is much different than the way a Republican system works. And the American system is a Republican system. So our prime minister may be the leader of the party that has the most seats in the House of Commons, but he can't say, do this, do that. You know, he can suggest things, but there are people that, you know, it's not a dictatorship. And Trump was trying to change the United States into a dictatorship, okay? That can't possibly, well, I shouldn't say it can't possibly happen here. God help us if it happens here. And I don't even believe in God, but somebody help us. My higher spiritual belief system that you and I have talked about at some point in time, maybe labeled as God with a lowercase g, but it accepts everybody. But anyhow, no, different kinds of democracies are more fragile than other kinds of democracies. And, you know, you've got places like Canada and Australia and New Zealand where we have a very similar system. We still have ties to the United Kingdom, except that those ties are just by virtue of some kind of tradition. It has nothing to do with being part of the British Empire. India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh cut all of their ties with the UK. And, you know, it makes sense. You know, all of us who were like colonists, the UK used us all as cannon fodder, okay? They used the Canadians, they used the Australians, they used the Indians, they used people from Bangladesh, they used people from Pakistan, they used all of us as cannon fodder in the First and Second World War. You know, so we'd all go in first and we'd get obliterated, and then the British troops would come in afterwards, right? And eventually we got sick of it. So, and now the Brits, you got to give them credit for creating a nightmare with India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Okay, that was just a poorly thought out plan. So, you know, where empires go, wreckage follows. And you know, you guys had an empire, right?
Yes, we did.
It lasted for a long time.
Yes, it did.
India had an empire. It lasted for a long time. Thailand had an empire. It got saved actually by a king who managed to negotiate properly with the French and the British to prevent being taken over by either. You got to say this guy was smart, but you know, empires rise, empires fall,
Yeah.
and democracies are delicate, fragile things. I'm, you know, look at the Philippines right now. Look at the Philippines. I'm quite certain that if Duterte was not reelected, that a fascist state would come out of it. Is that Duterte is a lot like Trump in some senses, okay? Bolsonaro in Brazil, he's like Trump. And he's a populist. And you know, Modi in India is like Trump too. He's a populist. And where populism rises, racism emerges. And in India, I have a lot of friends in India, and I do research with people in India. And, you know, I tell them, and some of them like Modi, and some of them don't, but I say, you know, here's the whole problem with the kind of populism that Modi is promoting. It's just like the populism that Trump was promoting. And what that does is it divides people. And India is even more problematic in that sense because you still have a caste system in place, even though it's really not supposed to be there. Technically, it's still there. So it goes from Brahmin down to Dalit. And the people in the lower castes are treated far differently than the people in the higher castes. So what does this populism do? Okay, it may lead to more discrimination against the lower castes. Now let's take this and twist it even more. There's a Muslim minority group in India who are discriminated against, but of that Muslim minority group, there's only 10% that's Shia. So I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Indian Shia, and she says to me, I've got Indians who hate me because I'm Muslim, and I've got extremists who want to behead me because I'm an infidel. And I said, gee, I wouldn't like to be in your position.
Sure.
So, I mean, populism can be very bad. And I'm worried about that in India, because India's on the brink of potentially becoming, first world country if they play the cards right. But if they don't, see, in the West, and you and I talked about this, and you talked with this about Jeff, the West did a really crappy job dealing with the pandemic. And you guys, you and I ran the numbers the other day. You've done very well, okay? We've done a terrible job. So the East, basically, look at it this way. Every single Islamic country, and except for something happened in Northwest Africa. I don't know why. Northeast Africa, sorry. I don't know why, but like places like Tunisia, okay, went from having really good rates to like having really bad rates compared to the rest of Asia, okay? But like other than that, other than a few exceptions, every Islamic country has done quite well. And again, it has to do with this collectivism idea that we've talked about before, compared to this greedy American, Western individualism. And, you know, India's doing well. Thailand has less than 1 death per million people. China appears to be doing well. Much of Central Africa is doing very well. Like Nigeria has only got 6 deaths per million people. Sri Lanka's got about 6 deaths per million people. And you know, I've got a friend in Thailand that I'm doing work with. They're still wearing masks everywhere. Okay, they got basically no COVID, right? They're still wearing masks everywhere, and they're following all of the rules, and they kept their borders closed. They kept and look at Thailand's major source of income is tourism. Okay, so keeping your borders closed is really bad for your economy. Same with Vietnam now. Vietnam has a huge tourism business, and so does Egypt. You got to keep your borders closed. We took, because of greedy economic reasons, over here, we took far too long to close our borders. And as soon as the first case arrived in Italy, Canada should have shut everything down, including with our border with the US. We should have been just shut down. Okay. And then what happened was different parts of Canada tried to reopen their economies far too quickly, and they hadn't got rid of COVID. And then they started saying, well, there's a second wave. It's not the second wave, you idiots. You didn't get rid of it. If you'd gotten rid of it, there would be no second wave, right? If it's gone, it's gone. Okay. And I know this because second waves are not selective. Second waves don't say, well, we're not going to have a second wave in Thailand or in Sri Lanka, and we're not going to have a second wave in India, but you know what? We're going to have a second wave in Canada, you know, and in Italy and in Spain. But back to that, now to take this back full circle, is India's doing a good job with its vaccination program. It's doing a good job with its maintaining its internal economy. Look, there's almost 1.4 billion people living there. But if you want to become first world country, you can't treat women as second-class citizens. So there's got to be, and you can't have discrimination based on castes or based on religion, because if that happens, the first world is not going to accept you as a first world nation. If you discriminate against women and you discriminate based on religion and you discriminate based on some kind of social status, okay, then now talk about hypocrisy. You think that doesn't go on here? Right? So, but what I'd really like to see for all developing nations is that they maintain their collectivist ideals and also broaden their economies so that people aren't poor, so that people aren't starving. And you and I talked about this when we were not online before. It's Bill Gates keeps giving away his money, right? He gives away his money, but he does it in a good way. He set up these charities, he set up vaccination programs around the world. And what happens? You get these insane conspiracy theorists who say Bill Gates Bill Gates and Microsoft are trying to control the world through vaccinations. That's like, you got to give your head a shake. So first of all, Bill Gates isn't associated with Microsoft anymore. And secondly, Bill Gates doesn't need all the money that he has, so he's trying to help humanity. And there are other really rich people who have been doing the same thing. And as we talked about before, in Islam, you're supposed to give 2.5% of everything that you have to help society. And I think that that's a really good idea, but it should be higher. And I think that the West, we should be giving a lot more to help the world. And Canada does a really good job on the international stage helping the world. We give more money per capita than almost every country in the world to humanitarian causes. We're way ahead of the United States, like way, way, way ahead of the United States. And the United States is the wealthiest country in the world. Soon China might be. I don't know. There's just too much difference between the rich and the poor everywhere. And that's a problem. And COVID's making it worse because people can't work in some places. And, in the United States, when they passed this relief bill, then they were going to give everybody $600, okay? You might not understand this, but $600 in the United States does nothing. It's not going to pay your rent. It's not going to pay for any food. It's actually giving people $600 a month. If you lived in New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, $600 does nothing for you. Absolutely nothing. Even $2,000, which they're going to end up getting as soon as Biden is president, is still a really small amount of money to live on per month, especially if you're a family of 4, for example, okay? I mean, it's near impossible. I know this because at one point in my life, I was in a position where I had, for a few month period, I had a very meager income, and it was $1,500 Canadian a month. You cannot live on $1,500 Canadian a month. Absolutely impossible, okay? And I live in a place that's not expensive to live in. My apartment was $1,000 a month. So now I'm down to $500. I've got to help support my kid who lives with my ex-wife. All of a sudden I got no money. So what do? I lose weight. I drink water. We need some changes in the world. I still think democracy is the best approach. I'm not convinced that countries that have 7,000 parties like Israel, that's the best approach to democracy. I believe that the kind of system that they have in the US is useless because there are only 2 parties and they need a third. A 3-party system or a 4-party system is pretty good. When you get beyond that, it just gets out of hand. In the United States, the problem is in the Senate, there's not proportional representation. So North Dakota, where like 2 people live, has 2 senators, and California, where millions and millions of people live, have 2 senators. Well, I say where 2 people live in North Dakota, okay, that's hyperbole, right? I mean, but it's very small population relative to California, and they get equal representation. It doesn't make any sense. So what do? You either change the Senate to proportional representation, or you get rid of it. And the Electoral College in the United States is just a stupid system too, okay? What's wrong with popular vote? And part of the reason historically that the Electoral College system was put into place was basically so that the elite could control the masses, right? They could override the masses if they wanted to. And it's happened. Not intentionally. It's not that intentionally. Like in the last, look at when Bush v. Gore, Gore won the popular vote, but Gore lost the election because of the Electoral College. So no, Gore won the popular vote, but lost because of the Electoral College. Clinton won the popular vote, but lost because of the Electoral College. Okay, now what's wrong with that system? There's something wrong with that system. In Canada, we have a Senate that pretty much just rubber stamps things. And I think it should be abolished because all it is basically wasted money, because these are like appointments that are given to people for, like, you know, they contributed to Canada, they did this, they did that, or they supported a particular political party or another particular political party. But basically, they get paid money for doing nothing, as far as I can tell. So why are we wasting our money on them? We don't need them. We don't need a Senate, or if you're going to have a Senate, make it elected. So the United States also has problems with respect to how much power lobbying groups have, okay, and how much money corporations can give to candidates. And, you know, I mean, essentially you can buy a candidate, and you really can't do that in Canada unless the candidate's really cheap. Unless this person has no moral values and is really, really easy to buy. But hopefully the world's going to change. You guys are going to come out. Your economy is going to end up being, I think, much better than it was, because what's going to happen, in my opinion, I could be wrong, because this is just opinion. I don't have any data on this, but I think that when we shut down first, okay, and went down, and then that hit the economy. Then we went down, our rates went back up again because they reopened the economy too quickly, okay. Maybe that's what happened in Tunisia, because it's a good tourist destination. Maybe they reopened, I don't know, I'd have to look. But then it goes up again, we're getting more COVID, you got to shut the economy down again. Well, what's that do to the economy? So you've shut the economy twice now. And here's the bigger potential long-term catastrophic effects. And that is healthcare. In many countries like Canada, we have universal healthcare. Now, the best thing to do about COVID is not get it, okay? And why? Well, you're too young for this, but back when I was young, our parents, when we were babies, would intentionally take us to chickenpox parties and expose us to chickenpox so that we got chickenpox and then we were immune to chickenpox for the rest of our lives. But they didn't realize back then that chickenpox stays in your body and reemerges 50 years later or so as shingles. So then when you get older, you have to get shingles vaccination so you don't get shingles. Now, shingles aren't deadly, but apparently they're very painful, okay? Well, what if COVID-19 lives in your body, and so a 17-year-old who gets COVID-19, it reemerges when the kid's, like, 45, as a deadly respiratory infection, and the life expectancy now of those kids that are infected today becomes 50 years old. And then what does that do to the healthcare system? Of course, it means you bankrupt the country based on healthcare, right? You're trying to save these people's lives, and maybe they'll come up. Maybe they'll do what they did here. They managed to come up with vaccines in a much quicker time than I ever expected. So And politicians, of course, they want to get their economies reopened. They don't think about what's going to happen 40 years from now. Because what happens 40 years from now doesn't affect whether they get reelected, does it?
Yeah, true. Okay, Professor, it has been more than awesome talking to you as always. Thank you so much for that indeed.
Okay, take care. Have a good one.